This is the second time I've made this presentation, and each time I dig back into this, I learn more things, I do more research, I unravel more parts and pieces of the story. There's easily enough for volume 1 and probably volume 2 of history books that could be written about law enforcement in Meade County. So we'll start talking about the whole thing about the sheriff, a little background for it, and then we'll dive into the stories. And I'm going to finish fast so that we can just all get our chairs in a circle here and tell Johnny Yeager stories until dark, you know. And with Mr. Ehlers here now, we've got a validator for all of these stories, that true or not, but there's certainly no shortage of things just about that gentleman and his colleagues and the parts of history that he witnessed here in Meade County. The whole thing of the business about sheriffs, 19 men, 130 years. At some point there will be a woman who will be the sheriff of Meade County. I just know there will be at some point or another. And so I'll have to change my starting point. But just a quick little background for those of you that need a little refresher about this. Those of us that grew up watching Robin Hood on television and learned the evils of the Sheriff of Nottingham and what a bad guy he was. Oh, that's quite right. I started early. The roots of the whole idea of having a sheriff are solidly connected to English customs, practice, and law, as are much of how our nation was founded, with the connections to that, is that it would be law enforcement that would be separate from the military, a civilian law enforcement mechanism of one kind or another, and along the way, instead of being appointed by the king or the duke or the whatever, the sheriff started an elected post in the nation. In South Dakota, there are a couple of important milestones for the sheriff. And you can see there on the screen some of the early day things. I thought it was interesting to realize or to learn that the state legislature created this office of a game warden, fish commissioner. That was the first statewide mechanism that was created to enforce laws out in the country and elsewhere, and that fish commissioner was a lawman. And maybe that isn't so different from the sheriff of Nottingham, who was always catching poachers, who were, Robin Hood and his men were out stealing the king's deer. So, but here in and something I didn't put into this slide, but an important milestone was in 1963. There were a couple of things that came along, and even before 1963. One was that the state legislature changed the law so that the sheriff could run for more than 2 consecutive 2-year terms. And Sheriff Yeager took advantage of that in his first election that he won, and he just kept getting reelected and reelected and reelected. And we see that now in modern day Meade County. Sheriff Irwin has been reelected several times. And if you go statewide, you find that very often. The other date that isn't there that is important is in 1963, the state legislature changed the law and abolished the fee system that determined how sheriffs earned the bulk of their pay, their compensation, and went to a population-based sliding scale of compensation. So the sheriff in Minnehaha County and Pennington County earned more money than the sheriff in Perkins County did, or Meade County for that matter. And there was about 4 steps in their base pay that was created for the sheriffs. And that was a big deal. And it was a pill that some people didn't want to swallow. And the legislature finally made the change. The Sioux Falls Artist Leader newspaper and some other, I think largely East River newspapers, lobbied hard on their editorial pages and elsewhere with stories about why it would be a good thing to change the law so that the sheriffs weren't paid with the fee system and went to a base salary. And then they also they continued to earn, they were compensated for the mileage that they expended largely with their own privately owned vehicles, and for running the jail. And so if a sheriff could be economical, thrifty, someone, maybe if you were a prisoner and say, gee, with running the jail, why, then you were entitled to make a profit from that. That's kind of an ugly word, but that's really what it was. And so, and nowadays, all the sheriffs are paid on this sliding wage scale, and the county commissioners have the capability to raise the wages, of course, because there's still local control of all of that. So there's still political spin to some of this in terms of how that works. And if you look statewide at sheriff campaigns for election, there are candidates who will say, well, I can do it cheaper, or I can do it better, or whatever. So there's all of that dynamic as part of the elective part of politics. So we're talking here about 3,500 square miles, the state's largest county, one of the largest counties in the nation. Today, 30,000 people, and when Meade County was created in 1889, I believe the population was something a little more than 4,000. Same territory to cover, but so law enforcement at the sheriff level today, they serve 30,000 people. They're busy. And in Meade County, there are city police departments in Sturgis, Somerset, and Faith. There's no city police in Black Hawk or Piedmont, not yet, but at some point or another, who knows. So the first sheriff, William WFL, he's always identified in news accounts by his initials, but he was William Suter, and his last name gets spelled different ways in some of the stories that I've read. And so he was the first sheriff. He was already a busy businessman and law enforcement guy, fire warden. He had a couple of different duties that he did in Lee Deadwood, and then came down here at Sturgis. He was the fire warden in Sturgis, which is kind of how he rolled down into Sturgis. And in those days, there was still a lot of allegiance to Lawrence County, because Lawrence and Meade County. Lawrence County is one big giant county, and then Meade County split away from that. So Suter, with his Lee Deadwood credentials, comes to town and becomes the first sheriff. And when he served for 20 months, because as the first guy, the Meade County wasn't created on the natural cleft of an election year. And so he was in office for 20 months, ran for re-election and lost. He's one of the very few sheriffs to lose, an incumbent sheriff, to lose a chance to stay in office for another term. And interesting fellow, kind of really a lifelong lawman of one kind or another. After he stops being sheriff, he becomes a bounty hunter, for lack of a better way to describe it. And he started on the trail of a guy who had escaped jail, he was a murderer, escaped jail East River, and took off, and Suter knew where he was, or had a hunch. And this guy went out to the Seattle area and was working in a mine right on the Pacific coast. And so Suter goes out there to catch him, because there's a big reward that he's going to collect for capturing this escaped murderer. And gets there and quietly goes to the mine company owners and says, I'm a lawman, and I'm chasing that guy. And they put him on the payroll. So he went to work at the mine in an effort to be kind of lunch bucket buddies with this murderer, to get him to tell a little bit of his story, confess enough so that they could say, yeah, you're the guy. Guess what? You're under arrest. And so he's there working in the mine, and they were putting a fire into a steam boiler. That was one of Mr. Suter's his job. He was a laborer, worker bee in the mine, and he couldn't fake it. He had to work alongside of this murderer and, you know, be a real miner, you know, a real worker. And the boiler exploded and killed him. And so they did find, they captured the murderer guy because the mine officials knew that, you know, as soon as they get to talking over lunch or whatever, and this guy kind of spills the beans on what he had done back in South Dakota. So the mine officials contacted the local law enforcement people and they locked this guy up. But Suter then, he's dead. And his wife she had moved out there to live with him in the Seattle area. And she came back to Sturgis then, had to go back to Seattle to settle the affairs. And they discounted the reward money that they paid to her. Well, you know, we have, equal pay for equal work, you know, these days. Well, and she was the heir to her husband's wages, as it were, but she only got less than half the reward money. But while she was there, she was on a ferry boat going somewhere in Puget Sound, and the ferry boat and a coal barge collided. And to get 5 people were killed in this water collision, and Mrs. Suter was injured, and all of that. So this, you know, these old timers had their stories to tell as well in terms of what they did and the like. So the next sheriff is Valentine Beaver, comes along, and this is when the sandstone courthouse was under construction. He was there to supervise the hanging of John J. Hicks, who was convicted of killing a rancher, John Henry Meyer. And Hicks was hanged in 1894. So the first sanctioned hanging here in town, or in the county. Then Jesse Brown gets to be the sheriff. And Jesse Brown served 8 years. He had a break in office. He had to refresh his eligibility to be sheriff. So he served 4 years, and he had to sit out for a while, and then he ran for office again. And that was not uncommon across the state. With a popular sheriff would kind of cool off, and often a deputy would run, or a family member, or something like that. So, and Jesse Brown, in addition to serving for a sheriff for a total of 8 years, he later was the Register of Deeds from Meade County, and he and another guy named Willard, they wrote a book about their young lives here in the frontier, in the Lee, Deadwood, Sturgis, the Northern Hills, and what it was like to be in law enforcement. A lot of those guys were the equivalent of modern day truck drivers. They were wagon masters, teamsters, whatever. They hauled freight from the railheads to the mines and elsewhere. And so, and Brown was a popular fellow who went on then in partnership with this other guy. And this book is available in the library if you want to read. It's a very readable book. And it's his memoir. He and his buddy, Mr. Willard, their memoir of what life was like in those days and how they got along. John Smith is the next sheriff, and that's when Delano and Scobie counties merge with Meade County. Out east and north, there were 2 separate counties that finally merged. The taxpayer, the ranchers out there, the taxpayers realized, geez, yeah, we want local control and we want independent government and all that, but that's going to make our taxes go up. And it's too complicated or it's too expensive. And so they just, those 2 counties disappeared and they merged in with Meade County. And that happened some other places in South Dakota as well, where counties, they either split or they merged, depending on what the voters wanted and the like. And nearly always, if you kind of peel back the onion, it's all about taxes and who was paying more than somebody else and the like. So Smith is sheriff when Ernest Loveswar murders a rancher. There are two guys, actually. And it's a lover's triangle in some respects. It's a complicated deal. He's murdered. Sheriff Jesse Brown is involved. He's a deputy. He helps arrest Loveswar. And this story, it's this cops and robbers thing of Loveswar when he murdered the two guys, he took a check, a bank check, and tried to cash it, I think in Whitewood. And the bank said, no, wait a minute, something's not right here. And they contacted the sheriff, and pretty soon they caught the guy and put him in jail, and he was hanged just on the west side of the courthouse where the gallows was put up.
Do you know where that picture was taken of the hanging?
It's right outside of the courthouse. That's where they built the gallows. The sandstone courthouse, yep. And the voting right now, because there's a myth or a legend or an apocryphal story that connects with the hanging of Ernest Loveswar. As to whether or not one or more of the sisters at St. Martin's took the kids out of school and walked them across the street so that they could witness the hanging. The wages of sin are... So, now, some of the people that I've talked to would just, they would put their hand on a Bible and say, yep, that happened. And other people, and it's the majority, say, it's a good story, but it really didn't happen. This is the hanging, that it was a ticketed event. They built a scaffold, a wooden screen around the gallows and all of that, and so only the people that had a ticket could come inside to witness the execution. And the notion of, Sister Drusilla the Cruel taking second graders across the street into this somber event, it boggles the mind. Yes?
What income did they make that day for the event?
Oh, did they sell the tickets? I don't know. Maybe so, yeah. And some of these tickets still exist here in town. They are part of family keepsake memoirs, a treasure of the ticket to this hanging. And Loveswar is the poor fellow who was hanged twice. He didn't die in the first drop of the trapdoor. And so he made a second trip. And
sell tickets again.
Yeah. So that'd be a Supreme Court case. The sentence was hanging, and he hanged. Well, he just didn't die. And so is he free to go? I don't know. The lawyers would have to sort that out. So anyway, that's John Smith, the sheriff. Next comes Thomas Stewart. His parents were from Canada. He had a ranch in Bear Butte Valley. Many of the early day sheriffs were also ranchers. The job didn't pay all that well, or they weren't all that busy, probably a combination of things that allowed them to continue their ranch operations. And they would have had children that could have run the ranch, or family members, or whatever. And so Thomas Stewart's ranch was in Bear Butte Valley. He died, I think, in Portland, Maine. His wife sure enough did. When he left office, his wife was not well, and the doctor's recommendation was you need to move to the California coast for your health. So they went to California, and then somehow ended up on the other coast in Portland, Maine. And Mrs. Stewart died in 1930. And I have looked and looked, and I can't find an obituary for Thomas Stewart. But one of the things that that Sheriff Stewart was involved in. And it wasn't a jailbreak, and there have been several jailbreaks down through the years, even out of the modern courthouse and jail, or escapes, I guess you would call them. But Stewart, it was the duty of sheriffs, he had to transport a prisoner from somewhere out on the West Coast, and I think to take him to Sioux Falls ultimately. And they were on the train, and they stopped in Denver overnight to rest. And Stewart, or the prisoner, I don't have the man's name in my note here. His wife is traveling in the train car as well. And if any of you remember the movie from the 1970s, Cinderella Liberty? That's an old Navy story about this poor chump sailor who's has to go to Fort Leavenworth or whatever, and two NCOs are given the duty of escorting him from point A to point B, and they realize this chump is just this naive kid who committed a crime, and he's going to prison for a long time, and so they want to take him out for kind of one more night on the town, his Cinderella Liberty. And well, this Thomas Stewart is escorting the prisoner, and this prisoner, he wasn't a murderer. There's a white-collar crime of embezzlement, I think, or something like that he had been convicted of. Convinces the sheriff that, well, my wife is here in the hotel, and I just really would like to spend one more evening with her before I get locked up. And the sheriff said, well, okay. And the prisoner doesn't come back. And he doesn't come back, so the Sheriff Stewart goes up and knocks on Mrs. Stewart's, or the prisoner's wife's hotel room, and she wakes up ostensibly asleep, like, oh, where's your husband? Well, he was here. Well, literally, the window's open, the fire escape ladder is down, and this guy is gone. And so so that's poor Sheriff Stewart. That's his that's his place in history. Then comes Joseph Collins as the sheriff. An interesting story about him is that they are looking for a bad guy who they think is linked to the disappearance of this Vail rancher named Stanford Beals. And they're out looking for him, and they can't find him, and they're coming back into town, and they think that the bad guy has gone along this same path, and I think it's essentially Highway 34 leading out Bear Creek Gap toward Fort Meade. And geez, where could he be? And we haven't found any evidence and all of that. And so they see a well. And so we better check the well. Do diligence for the lawman. And so Sheriff Collins and Robert Cruikshank, and that's got to be the father or grandfather of the Cruikshank family from here. They're looking over this well down in this hand-dug well, and they can't see the bottom of the well. And so they get a piece of paper, and they light the piece of paper on fire, and they put it in the well, and the piece of burning paper goes down. And it's getting down into the lower reaches of the well, and they hear this poof, and they see a little flash of flame, and they think, and then that little puff put the fire out. So well, they didn't have the modern, deputies 6-battery, billy club flashlight that they could use, and so they did a lantern. I mean, that's a good steady light, and it's brighter than a piece of burning paper. So they light the lantern, they lower it down into the well, and they're looking over the edge, thinking there's going to be a pistol down there, or a dead guy, or who knows. And instead of just a little poof that puts the flame out, there's an explosion that puts Collins and Cruikshank in the hospital for a little while as they recover from this kaboom that blew up the well, and thus their place in history. Good old Sheriff Collins. Then Roy Scott comes along, and you see he's a Democrat. If I've kept the math straight, there's been, the Democrats are ahead by 1 in the elective history of the sheriffs of Meade County. And just in numerically in their, a good bit of that, of course, is Johnny Yeager, a Democrat, was in office for a very long time. And so that his elections didn't necessarily put an opportunity for a Republican to win. But Roy Scott comes along, and claim to fame for him as a lawman is that he, working in cooperation with other sheriffs and law enforcement officers, they broke up a gang of horse thieves that were operating here in northwestern South Dakota, across the line in Wyoming, and up into Montana. And you read the news accounts of this, and that was quite a deal in those days, you know, before the internet and instant communication and all that. These guys were talking to each other on the telephone or with telegrams and letters, coordinating back and forth to try to catch these horse thieves that were on the lam, and they successfully prosecuted these fellows as well, and so earning his spot in the history books. Scott's son, VJ, goes on to become a lawyer, and then was the chief executive officer of Mutual of Omaha Insurance for his career. And remember, we all watched Mutual of Omaha, Wild Kingdom on television when we were kids. Well, that was VJ Scott, the son of the sheriff. He was the corporate guy. He was writing the checks to sponsor that television program that promoted Mutual of Omaha Insurance to a nationwide audience. Scott was married twice. And I can imagine, you know, this is a studio portrait of him. You know, he's a handsome, you know, politician kind of a guy that must have been from a intellectually rich and complex family that had visions that went beyond the borders of Meade County. Then there's Fred Westgate, and in some accounts you'll see Westgate's name is spelled without the T. It's Westgate. He's the unlucky guy who is the sheriff of Meade County when Prohibition starts. He serves 2 years in office. He doesn't win his re-election bid. You know, the moonshine vote, I think, probably said, we got to get rid of it. He's too enthusiastic about enforcing Prohibition. And but an interesting fellow nonetheless. His daughter later went on to work in the state brand office in Pierre. And so in some respects, law enforcement can be a family business in one way or another. And so if you read the news accounts, the sheriffs, their children, their siblings, others find their way into other law enforcement careers elsewhere in the state or around the country. Also during this time, with Prohibition, the office, the state government, South Dakota government, starts to think about, and they finally enact, they create a state sheriff, the office of state sheriff, and there were deputy state sheriffs as well, in large part to help with chasing after moonshiners. And you know, you can use the term moonshiner, and that kind of, in my mind, is just old Gus, you know, making a little whiskey in the barn. You know, our grandfather. You know. My sister's in the audience. Grandpa Vic back in Minnesota. Cooked moon. as the term was used in those days and was known for that. And I got a hunch he wasn't going to run Jim Beam out of business or anything like that. He was making whiskey in the chicken coop, or something like that. Well, in South Dakota, there were a lot of moon cookers, kind of making whiskey for their own needs, or their neighbors, or their family, or whatever it was. But then there were some big-time operations, and the sheriff, local sheriffs, state's attorneys, federal law enforcement authorities, and the Office of State Sheriff busted some of these big operations. And these were dairy barns that were turned into factories. They were making whiskey by the barrel, not by the bottle. And gunfights, the whole deal. This was contentious business back during the era of Prohibition. You see there for Westgate, he died at home, Masonic funeral. In those days, there were some sheriffs who were Catholic, and largely they were buried at St. Aloysius, and then all the rest were Protestants, and nearly all of those men were Masons. And so that was an important part of society in Meade County. Next comes John Emerson, another guy who has a break in service. He was sheriff for a total of 8 years. There were, oftentimes the primary election was the really telling race for the office of sheriff. And in 1932, Emerson had to run in the Republican Party, and against, including a guy named Stacy Finner of Elm Springs, had 11 kids. And big families were big families in those days, but there was, and then finally in the race, there was Finner, an independent Jesse King, another man named C.C. Titus, Lloyd McNeil, and J. Lee Forbes. And so the ballots for these elections for sheriff would have been lengthy, and particularly in the primary elections, they were muscling with each other to get a chance for the final, for the November election. Also, while Emerson was sheriff, there was a shootout on Main Street, right at the intersection where the Bearview Valley Bank was. A fugitive, we would say today, they didn't call it that in the news accounts, but carjacked a taxi in Kansas, forced the taxi driver to drive him and another guy to get away. They were going to Canada, or who knows. They were getting out of Kansas, and they got here to western South Dakota. Law enforcement's on their tail, and some deputies in Pennington County get involved. They chase the guys up here to Sturgis, and finally get them cornered on the intersection that was First Street and Main, where the bank is, where the bank building is. And there was a gunfight, there was a shootout there. And the taxi driver's killed, another fellow was killed, the deputies are wounded with ricochet bullets that bounce off the gravel street, and they didn't have to, I don't think they were hospitalized, but nonetheless they got the Purple Heart that day for their duty. And that, someone help me here, was the Bearview Bank, the Walker Brothers Bank, ever robbed? At least once? Okay. And I think there may be confusion with local stories between this shootout that unfolded right out on the street and the robbery itself, where the bank, the holdup guys came in and robbed the bank. So, and I think roughly the same time period of,
Not too far apart, I don't think.
yeah, in those days. So,
Was it a Bruce Willis movie?
So a dead guy, 3 wounded. The fugitive is captured. The fugitive gets away and runs. He gets in the taxi and he's driving. And he's going east on Main Street. And he should have turned at Lover's Lane and got onto the highway. Instead, he went up to the cemetery. Hey, no, you're not going any farther than that. And so he gets out of the car and runs, then hides in the woods, and a soldier from Fort Meade caught him the next day. And so that was...
The pallbearers are kind of interesting.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
Harold Walker, the Bearview Bank.
Yeah, from the bank. Yeah. And Ted Reese. And,
Garlic.
Garlic, Carrigan.
so, and another Masonic funeral. So, the send-off there for Mr. Emerson, Sheriff Emerson. Then comes Bruce Barnes as the sheriff. Another guy who looks darn good in hat. I don't have pictures of all of the sheriffs, but when I saw this one, I thought, man, that's Mr. Barnes. You know, the people my age remember for being the janitor at the high school. You know, and so he was appointed state sheriff. He organized this mechanism of vigilantes, that's what they were called in the news accounts, to help catch fugitives. He was the first president of the Peace Officers Association. He was involved in promotion of the motorcycle rally. Served as justice. When Sidney Voorhees died, he was appointed to fill Sid's job as the magistrate here in town. Interesting guy. He was way more than the janitor at the high school. And,
Was that the Barnes that was mayor in the 50s?
and yes, he was briefly mayor. Yes, he was a one-term mayor as well. And he was a baseball coach. And back during the days when he was an active lawman, the sheriffs and police departments here in the hills had baseball teams. And he was the manager of a team called the Sheriffs. And they played in some tournaments. They had some success one way or another. It's kind of like the carvers at Mount Rushmore. You know, when you got hired on at Mount Rushmore to be a carver, you know, you had your resume or your whatever equivalent of that was. You know, that I'm a homestead gold miner, or I'm a truck driver, or a ranch hand. Well, yeah, let's see your fastball. You know, because some of the miners or the men that got hired to work on Mount Rushmore were hired as much for their baseball skills as they were, because they had a baseball team, and they had fun with that and helped promote the project and the like. And so, in fact, the gentleman who just the last living carver who just was, you look at his obituary, part of why he was hired, he was a young man, he was 17, probably had a good fastball, or, you know, he could throw from center field all the way in, you know, or whatever it was, a good hitter. So next comes William Moore. There were at least 2 jailbreaks during his term of office. And one of them, his wife had to help out with holding the escapee didn't get clear away. And while Sheriff Moore went to get more help or whatever, why Mrs. Moore, who would have been probably living in the jail at the time in the apartment there, kept the shotgun on this guy. He decided he didn't want to run anymore. And Vern Doyle, my 8th grade science teacher, was a high school student then, played taps at Sheriff Moore's funeral. Sheriff Moore was a World War I veteran and one of the very first patients to be admitted to Fort Meade. Because, you know, those of us who grew up here, you think of Fort Meade, well, it really got started for World War II. Well, yes, it did, but it served all veterans, and so that would include World War I veterans, and Sheriff Moore was one of those. And then Floyd Schreckengoss, his name is spelled sometimes without the G, but
Not a very electable name there.
Well, it's hard to fit on a bumper sticker, yeah. Just vote for Floyd, you know, that'd be an easy way to do that, so. And Schreckenhaus was a community activist as well. 1938, he was involved in the Tourist Bureau that was supporting the very early versions of the rally. Was 38 the first year, second year? But anyway, early on, he was involved he was president of the Chamber of Commerce, ran for office as county coroner as a Democrat, and he and the sheriff that followed him, they got sued in a false arrest case that drug on in the courts for a while, and finally was settled, and Walter A. Miller, not Walter D., Walter A. Miller, who was the sheriff that followed him, they were sued for false arrest, and the case was finally settled, and the judge or jury, I can't remember now how the trial went, the suit was brought for $20,000, and the settlement was $200,000. So, was this the plaintiff, was he falsely arrested? Well, technically, apparently, but it was worth $200 instead of $20,000. So, there's more to that story, I'm sure, that is reported in the news accounts. So, and then Walter Miller then is the Sturgis auditor in 1950. That happens a few times as well with sheriffs or deputies that after they've served their term and maybe they try to run for election again after a break in service or whatever, they continue to work in either county or city government, one way or another. And then C.L. Ted Donaldson, not to be confused with Kelly Donaldson. So, or Bobby Donaldson, because that's the trail, the lineage of the Donaldson family. So Ted is the grandpa, and he was the sheriff. But just for 2 years, he lost his bid for a second term. And there was a campaign to shut down casino-style gambling in Black Hawk. And there were a couple of gambling houses. There was a supper club in Black Hawk, and then another establishment. And they were running poker games and other things there. I would guess, gee, where did the dog track get built? You know, in Black Hawk. But the proximity of Ellsworth Air Force Base probably made a gambling establishment a better business opportunity in the Rapid City area, just across the line in a different county in a different city jurisdiction. But Donaldson and Miller both were involved because these gambling places would get raided more than once. And during Donaldson's term of office, they brought the slot machines and the roulette wheel or things like that, and they had a bonfire on the grounds of the courthouse. And, you know, the wages of sin. We're going to burn your slot machines here. You know, and maybe the kids from St. Martin's watch that. Sister, there's a fire. And the Donaldson family still has their grandpa's badge when he was a deputy sheriff. And I threw that picture in just the Faith Building, just so that we all remember that Meade County is huge, and that Faith is it's kind of another world, but it isn't, because it's in the county. And there was, and Sheriff Ehlers, maybe you can verify this or not, but when I was a kid and a young adult here in Sturgis, there was this story, legend, or whatever, that you can't get elected in sheriff of Meade County unless you can drive to Faith in under an hour. And it's 102 miles, and so.
You've done that.
Yeah, you've done that. And so, yeah, they have a good car and kind of nerves of steel to negotiate that highway at speeds that would allow you to get there in an hour, you know, before the body stiffened up or whatever, you know, before the trail of the bad guys went cold, or the fight in the bar was still going on, you know, depending on what you were there, being summoned for. But that's Ted Donaldson. He was Clarence Donaldson. Kelly Donaldson, his son, was the banker here in town.
Yeah.
Kelly was his nickname, I think, as well. And he was CL, they both went by their initials. CL Donaldson, and then Kelly Donaldson was LC Donaldson, I think. Anyway. And Bob Donaldson, the retired teacher, he's Bob. And so, or Stretch, as he calls himself. So, one of the kind of the gruesome things that happened, sad things during Donaldson's term as sheriff was there was a hit and run death of a young girl on Junction Avenue. I think that case was never resolved, and that was a sad story. You read of that event itself, and then the subsequent funeral and continued investigation and the like.
Let me tell you a story of that. It was during the winter, and we had a snow. There was quite a lot of snow around. There's a lot of snow on the road yet. And that was in the days on Junction Avenue when across from Bates Grocery, there used to be a filling station there.
Okay.
I happened to be in Bates Grocery that day. And I was standing there talking to Mr. and Mrs. Bates. She was sitting in her big chair in back, and she came up to visit with Mr. Bates and I. I happened to look south up the street, and here come this pickup, flipping around in the road and spinning like a damn top, coming and went right through that filling station, didn't hit a pump at all, came right across the street, parked right in the spot where Mrs. Bates had been sitting, which at one time was the old garage door. And when it finished, the pickup was entire, had been absorbed by the old garage. Mr. and Mrs. Bates were standing there, dumbfounded, and I left.
So that was a winter event then.
Yeah, it was a winter event, yeah.
Okay. And you know, that's regrettably a sad story. And then Sweet Anderson comes along, home from the war, another National Guardsman from Sturgis who went off for the adventure of all of that and the service of it. And there are lots of Sweet Anderson stories throughout his whole life of things that he was involved in. He served as sheriff for 2 terms, and then he ran for office against John Edgar several times. Never successfully, but nonetheless he tried. And the kind of the interesting story about Anderson that I found interesting anyway was this fence line argument between Tacky Goff and Maynard Newcomb. And Maynard Newcomb was married to Tacky Goff's sister, the famous rodeo trick rider performer and the like. And there was an argument over a gate that was left open, and some cattle and horses strayed one way or another. And the Newcomb, and how does this go? Because Newcomb goes after Tacky with a bullwhip, and Tacky had a .32 pistol. And so there was cracking and shooting, and I'm sure adult language exchanged and the like. And Maynard is wounded, Mr. Newcomb is wounded, and Tacky shot in his, shooting, hits Maynard's horse 3 times. Horse dies out of the deal. Mr. Newcomb survives and prospers, and So there was a trial and just all the dust up of all of that, that went on and on. And when, I got it somewhere else in my notes, but when the Newcomb Ranch finally sold here about 10 years ago, a millionaire construction tycoon from Florida bought that place for $6 million plus, I think. Bought the whole paradise out there, that big ranch, yeah. And the like. So, and when I gave this presentation several months ago, Swede's son Danny was in the audience, and I didn't recognize him. I honestly didn't. And Danny came up and asked to speak, and I thought, oh, wait a minute, that's Danny. And he just gave this heartfelt kind of summary of his dad and how he felt about his dad and his dad's place in the community and the like. Oh, that's, I didn't expect it. It surprised me. Yes?
What was the result of the legal entanglement?
Oh, well, Tacky was, I'm pretty sure he was convicted. I don't know that he went to prison or jail for any length of time, but yeah, he didn't get away with it. That's, you don't shoot somebody, arguing over, well, yeah, people shoot at each other, but you don't, well, that's the next story. That's the next sheriff. It's two sheriffs down, in fact. It's, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. So, and Sweet Anderson in 1982 he was either the leader or certainly was publicly visible circulating the petitions around town to stop the rally. He had taken up that banner and so next comes Carl Aga, the singing policeman. And Carl is Sturgis police chief, and he's the sheriff for 4 years, and he's the chief of police again. And after that, his law enforcement career ends. He goes back into the timber with his sons, I think, and they were loggers here in the area. And he got hurt in 1977 and died. He didn't recover from the accident, the logging accident. But another Hollywood picture of Carl Aga. I mean, just, lean and guy's got hair,
My wife says she doesn't have a picture of that.
Ah.
He's my uncle.
He's your uncle, okay. And
Yeah. He and my dad always sang together.
okay.
Our family, that's what they did when they got together.
Well, then we're
They
going to
sang.
talk to you about the music performers and the like. So, wore revolvers
Yeah.
and dressed in black
And rode his horse.
and rode his horse
in
in
the
parades and
parade.
things. We moved here. Virginia wasn't born yet, but our parents moved to Sturgis in 1954, and I can remember coming downtown. It must have been while he was chief of police or whatever, and our mom, who was from Minneapolis, she was a city girl who came here to Sturgis. I said, who is that? Oh, that's Carl Aga.
My sister was in high school and she was working. She crossed the street in the middle of the street, and Uncle Carl was going by. He stopped the car, got out, and went and got her, and walked to the corner with her, made her walk around it and walk back again, and told her that's how you cross the street. And she came home and told my dad. She cried. She said, and Uncle Carl made me do that. And Dad said, well, that's the way it goes.
And while Aga was sheriff, probably the most complicated story was the murder of Carl Gerber, and if I'm saying the last name right, Gerber.
Okay, the murder, yeah.
Yeah, he was murdered. He was a rancher, and he was, well, I'll just leave his life alone. Not all the relatives are gone yet, so I have to be careful about what I say, but his hired man was a kid, 18 years old, from Boys Town. He was kind of an orphan kid that got a ranch job out here in Meade County, working for the Gerbers. And there was Mr. Carl, who was a young man in his 30s, and his mother. And I don't know if there was a dad in that family or not by that time, but there was a family argument, and Billy Peck, who's this 18-year-old hired hand, shoots Carl 9 times with a .22 caliber rifle, and in a bedroom in the ranch house at night. I'm guessing maybe the lights weren't on, or not enough. And you're 19, and your ranch boss is there, and there's been a family argument between Mr. and Mrs. Gerber. And I sense from reading the news accounts, not the first one. So Gerber gets hauled off to the hospital. Billy Peck simply turns himself in after this event has happened. Gerber goes to the hospital and lingers. He lives 9 more days. And Sheriff Baga and the state's attorney are later accused, isn't the right word, but they didn't go up to the hospital in Rapid City and interview Mr. Gerber to get his side. And the stated reasons in the news account are that Gerber couldn't talk. He was so badly wounded that he couldn't talk. The mother later disputes that, saying that, well, she was there in the hospital room every day and he spoke, and used a plural pronoun. They tried to get me. Not one person, but they, not he, they. That figures into an appeal and all of this. While the case lingers, they finally get a change of venue. There's a delay in the trial, and the trial's held in Lawrence County. Peck is acquitted of manslaughter in this instance. And of course, Gerber's dead. They have an auction for his farm equipment and livestock. And there the story kind of hangs. And there's more to it than that. I'd invite you to look on newspapers.com to read deeper down into that and to see who the other players are involved in all of this. But the Gerber family felt that the wheels of justice were moving too slowly. And there was an accusation or concern that the widow would inherit the ranch instead of mom. And, does money get involved in these arguments? Well, occasionally. And so they got a petition signed by enough their neighbors, their ranch neighbors. They went to Pier and appealed to the South Dakota Attorney General to get involved in the case. And so there was political muscle being spent in this deal, change of venue from Meade County to Lawrence County for the trial, and an acquittal. And Gerber is in St. Aloysius, and Billy Peck is buried up the hill there.
They were hunting for SIPs too at the time when Uncle Carl was there. But
Yeah, and I would have been involved in that, and the like. And now,
John.
Johnny as the sheriff. And like I say, we just could get in a circle here, and everybody could tell Johnny stories.
He also was our neighbor boy.
Yes, and Mr. Sheriff Ehlers is here to validate or boost up these stories, whatever. But what a guy! He lived in Comanche Court for a little while when I was a little kid, and so it was, Sheriff Johnny's just down the street from us. And you can see here his political success of 13 consecutive victories. And during the time that he was in office, the state legislature made another important change and lengthened the term of office from 2 years to 4. That's when the governor's office, when a whole bunch of things were changed across South Dakota. And I have pages of Johnny's stories here, but a couple of things just to set your head in the history of it all. There was John had been sheriff just for less than 2 months, and there was a man who had been a mental patient, a patient at the Yankton Hospital, had gotten released back home with his mother, and this was a guy in his 30s, he wasn't a kid, and he went off his rocker, and there was a hostage, or not a hostage, but he held the authorities at bay, gunpoint. You come up to the house, I'm gonna shoot you, kind of thing. And Sheriff Egger, the assistance of others, got this guy talked down off the cliff and resolved the issue without any shooting. Nobody got hurt and the like. But you're the sheriff. You've been in office a month and a half, and all of a sudden, get in your car and get to Sherman Street, because that's where it happens. Just not too far from here, and sort that deal out. Then there was the Bud Flack cattle rustling case, and that was in 1956. At the time, that was numerically the largest number of cattle that had ever been rustled in one crime. And the rancher whose cattle were rustled, his name was Altfitch, am I pronouncing that right? He was a bachelor rancher. He left the place for a vacation or a trip or something.
He forgot to register his brand.
Yes. And Bud Flack
Took advantage.
took advantage of that, because somebody in Wyoming had gotten away with the same scam and didn't get into serious trouble for it. And so Flack rounded up, that guy must have been his whole herd, 230 some head.
Big bunch.
Yeah, 8 cattle trucks. Flack ordered up 9, they only used 8.
He ended up in Sioux Falls.
Took them to Sioux Falls, sold them.
Look, got him in trouble with taxes.
Okay,
So he didn't, right? At that time, livestock was taxed.
okay.
He got in trouble with that, sold the cattle down.
Now,
He served time.
yeah, yes, he did, yeah. And so that was an important case, and I'm already out of time, and we've got a couple more Johnny stories. The Rapid City Journal in those days had a big newsroom, and they sent reporters to the trial. I mean, it's big news. And one of their photographers took a picture of the courtroom while the trial was in action. In this day and age, cameras aren't permitted in courtrooms in South Dakota anyway. And but somebody had left the courtroom to go to the toilet or something, and the door was open, and the photographer was in the hallway and took a picture. And that was published on the front page of the paper. And you can see those pictures online and recognize faces of Evie Morrill and Sid Voorhees and some other people, the faces in the crowd of people that would have been participating, would have either witnessed that trial as spectators or were involved in either prosecution or the defense of Mr. Flack. So and it's during Johnny's term of office that the fee system is abolished, and the sheriffs go on wages. And then through the 70s, and here's where the stories come along of things that Sheriff Egger did with the American Indian movement in the tense times here in this community. The bike rally blew up during those years and went from being just 2 days of racing into 3 days of party, 4 days of party, 5 days of party. And the party part of the rally got way bigger than the races did. And so there's two stories, quick ones. And one involved a bike gang was out by the National Cemetery, I think, or Tilford. And they tried to rustle a steer. They were going to take.
They did.
They did. Now, they got it in a trailer, and they got caught. And they got drug into jail, and it was like the Sunday, rally ended on a Saturday, and it was the Sunday when they got caught. And John and the deputies, everybody was tired. They're done. The rally's over. We just want to get on with our life. And we got these yahoos coming in here. They're in jail, and what are we going to do with them? And so they had an impromptu courtroom proceeding for these gents. And one of the deputies, because the magistrate just couldn't be found, because he was the instant magistrate put on the robe, and they convinced these bikers that their fine was going to be whatever cash they had left. And here's the way out of town, don't ever come back. And when Joe Planback tells that story, it gets way better. Because he was one of the deputies, and so was Charlie Gray. Men with Medicare cards in their pockets, responsible citizens were, as young men in their 20s were in shenanigans with. And then there's another biker story that I just heard fresh from Joe this week. A biker decided to streak Main Street. So he takes off his clothes, and in the rally, geez, what's new with that? But please, so he's on his bike, and he's naked, and he drives up or down Main Street and gets caught, and gets put in jail. And his clothes are packed in some campground somewhere, or with his bike or whatever. And the deputies aren't going to get his clothes. Sorry, buddy. You were in public. We don't have any pants for you. So they gave the guy a blanket. Spends the night in jail. Next morning, it's his arraignment with a bunch of other, miscreants that are there. And the guy's apparently, according to Joy, he's got the blanket around him, and he's in the hallway of the courtroom, and it's his turn to go into the courtroom, and John pulls the blanket off the guy and pushes him into the courtroom. And so the guy is in front of the magistrate. So he's in front of the magistrate, and it was a law-trained magistrate, and I've forgotten his name now.
Ray Ritchie.
No, it wasn't Ray.
This Barney.
Well, this was after that. Anyway, so the magistrate says, Sheriff Hager, why is this man in my courtroom naked? And Johnny is in the courtroom, and Your Honor, the crime, the charge is indecent exposure. I wanted you to see the evidence. So, and why not? It just and the stories just, they go on and on. When you get people starting to talk about kind of his style and the way things got done, like, well, that was John.
We gave haircuts down there.
Oh, okay. And I don't know where the bathtub came into the courthouse garage, but there's a stock tank down there that, in an emergency, could be used as a bathtub for a prisoner that needed a dip first before moved upstairs into the jail with the other folks. Floyd Cleveland then becomes the sheriff. And Mr. Ehlers you're the acting sheriff for a time, and because John had gotten sick, or he retired, just retired early, and because he lived beyond 90.
Yeah.
So Floyd then wins election as a Republican. He had retired from the Highway Patrol. Many of you remember that he was an aviator, had his own airplane, he did a lot of different things. And he was the sheriff during the 50th rally, the anniversary rally, the 11 fatalities, the bar brawl and gunners. There's lots of Cleveland stories, I'm sure, as well, that would follow along. with his career in law enforcement, both as a state employee and then as a county employee. And you look across the history of the sheriff's office in South Dakota, there's lots of movement back and forth. City police, sheriff office, highway patrol, game wardens probably somewhere play into the equation, and others. And so not necessarily uncommon for that to happen. And then the present sheriff. And so in the interest of all of us here, we'll just, Sheriff Merwin will just, he'll have to leave office and then we can tell stories about him. But a hometown kid who joins the city police department and then runs for office. His first elected victory was as a Democrat. And because he had to face Cleveland and he couldn't win in the primary, I think he felt. And so he switched parties and
That way, he's not early in the year.
yes, yep. Yeah, and have June primary instead of waiting until the November election. And so he gets elected in 1990 and he's still in office. So that is, that brings us up to the present day. For those of you that want to know more about this, I'm not going to live long enough to write the book. You know, so. But there's enough for a 3-volume or a 2-volume set of sheriff stories just in Meade County. And I think that the one thing that as I read through the news accounts that sticks in my mind is that, and again, you know, harkening back even to the traditions of England that were brought over here in colonial times and set in place this mechanism of a civilian law enforcement person, not a military law enforcement person, who's elected, responsible to the voters, to the citizens, fits in our justice system here pretty well. And we've had more than 200 years of practice now of using this mechanism. There are a few states who don't have sheriffs. Alaska is one, Connecticut, I can't remember the other state. But sheriffs exist all across the country. Some of the departments are huge. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, I think, is 15,000 employees. It's an army, in a manner of speaking, but an elected sheriff. And if I'm remembering the reading that I did about it, there are 9 layers, starting with junior deputy, all the way up to sheriff. So that's how much kind of overhead or command and control structure there is in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. You know, in a huge metropolitan area that serves millions of people, and probably not much cattle rustling, but maybe some bikers and other bad guys to chase after. Yes?
Do you know the badge? Now, the sheriff there has 5 stars on it.
Mm-hmm.
But the highway patrol has 6 stars, I think it is. And I've asked different people, is there a reason for the number of stars on it?
That's true, but I don't know the reason.
There's no, just some have it and some don't have 6 stars.
I don't know. The heraldry of the sheriff's office, yes?
No, it's something else.
Oh, okay. It's important, you know, our county has had 19 men serve as sheriff over these years. And you go to the other counties and I think you would find similar experiences, good and bad, and so a bunch in the middle of how law enforcement is done at the county level. And I really haven't touched on the whole mechanism that the sheriff is responsible for in terms of running the jail and of serving papers.
Civil process.
Yeah, the civil process that's big and it's important.
And he's responsible for all felonies big time.
Okay.
Otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So, yes.
Does the sheriff or the county determine the number of deputies?
That's your county commissioner and the city council.
The commissioners decide everything.
Yeah, that's a money deal.
Yeah.
It really is. The owner.
Since we haven't told any Merlin stories and he's here, I worked with Merlin out at the visitor center at Tilford one summer, and Merlin, as he always does, looked very nice every time he came to work with his hat and everything on. None of the tourists asked to take my picture. And I don't know how many times Merlin had to pose for a Western picture for tourists out there. And I'd always said, and he was sheriff too, and oh my God, then they'd really take it.
Yeah.
His picture is all over the country.
And so and this is going to go on. I mean, it's just, it's part of the fabric of our community and the like. I welcome embellishments to what I've talked about here today. Anyway, I thank you all for coming today. As a little kid who worried about coming here to pay library fines, to come into this library today, as now a resident of Rapid City, where my wife and I live, to come into this really beautiful building and see how money is well spent and practically spent in this community to create something like this for citizens, for me is impressive. This is a neat place.